emperor frequently adverted to this critical point in the destinies of France, but I have hitherto refrained from entering upon the detail of a subject which presents nothing either agreeable or consolatory. Third, about 3 o'clock, the emperor sent for me to attend him in his chamber. He had just finished dressing, and as it was raining at the time, he went into the drawing room where he communicated to me some very curious particulars, which, as may be supposed, concerned him, and in which it played a conspicuous part. Sometimes afterward, the emperor took a turn on the lawn next to his library, but finding the wind very violent, he soon returned to the house and played at billiards, a thing which he very seldom thought of doing. In the course of the day, the emperor related that as he was once traveling with the empress, he stopped to breakfast in one of the islands of the Rhine. There was a small farm in the neighborhood, and while he was at breakfast, he sent for the peasant to whom it belonged and desired him to ask boldly for whatever he thought would render him happy. And in order to inspire him with the greater confidence, the emperor made him drink several glasses of wine. The peasant, who was more prudent and less circumscribed in his choice than the man described in the story of the three wishes, without hesitation specified the object which he was ambitious to possess. The emperor commanded the prefect of the district immediately to provide him with what he had made choice of, and the expense attending the gratification of his wish did not exceed 6,000 or 7,000 francs. Napoleon added that on another occasion, when he was sailing in a yacht in Holland, he entered into conversation with the steersman and asked him how much his vessel was worth. "My vessel," said the man, "is not mine. I should be too happy if it were. I would make my fortune." "Well, then," said the emperor, "I make you a present of it," a favor for which the man seemed not particularly grateful. His indifference was imputed to the phlegmatic temperament natural to his countrymen, but this was not the case. "What benefit has he conferred on me?" said he to one of his comrades who was congratulating him. "He has spoken to me, and that is all. He has given me what was not his own to give. A fine present, truly." In the meantime, Duroc had purchased the vessel of the owner, and the receipt was put into the hands of the steersman, who, no longer doubting the reality of his good fortune, indulged in the most extravagant demonstrations of joy. The expense of this purchase was about the same as that attending the present made to the countryman. Thus, said the emperor, it is evident that human wishes are not so immoderate as they are generally supposed, and that it is not so very difficult to render people happy. These two men undoubtedly enjoyed perfect happiness. When the emperor visited Amsterdam, the people, he said, were very hostile to him, but he soon completely ingratiated himself in the public favor. He declined being attended by any other guard than the guard of honor belonging to the city, and this mark of confidence immediately gained him the esteem of the Dutch. He constantly appeared among every class of citizens. On one occasion, he addressed a crowd of people in the following blunt manner: "It is said that you are discontented, but why? France has not conquered but adopted you. You are excluded from no benefits which are enjoyed by the French. You are a portion of the same family and participate in all its advantages. Consider now, I have selected my prefects, chamberlains, and counselors of state from amongst you in a just proportion to the amount of your population, and I have augmented my guard with your Dutch guard. You complain of distress, but in this respect, France has still greater reason to be dissatisfied. We all suffer, and we must continue to do so until the common enemy, the tyrant of the sea, the vampire of your trade, shall be brought to reason. You complain of the sacrifices you have made, but come to France and see all that you still possess beyond what we do, and then perhaps you will deem yourselves less unfortunate. Why not rather congratulate yourselves on the circumstances that have brought about your union with France in the present state of Europe? What would you be if left to yourselves, the slaves of all the world, instead of which, identified as you are with France, you will one day possess the whole trade of the great empire?" Then, assuming a tone of gaiety, he said, "I have done everything in my power to please you. Have I not sent you as a governor precisely the man who suits you, the good and pacific Lebrun? You condole with him, he condoles with you. You bewail your distresses together. What more could I do for you? At these words, the assembly burst into a loud fit of laughter. The emperor had secured the good graces of the multitude. However, said he, let us hope that the present state of things will not last long. Believe me, I am as anxious for a change as you can be. Every man of discernment among you must be aware that it is neither my wish nor for my interest that matters should remain as they now are. The emperor left the people of Amsterdam full of enthusiasm for him, and he, on his part, carried away impressions decidedly in their favor. Previously to his journey, he had often complained that whosoever he sent to Holland immediately became a Dutchman. After his return, that circumstance occurred to his recollection in the council of state, and he said that he had himself become a Dutchman. One day, when a member of the council spoke slightingly of the Dutch, the emperor said, gentlemen, you may be more agreeable than they, but I can wish you nothing better than to be possessed of their moral qualities. After dinner on the 3rd of September, someone happened to mention the date of the day upon which the emperor made some very remarkable observations, among which were the following. This, said he, is the anniversary of hard and appalling executions of reaction in miniature of St. Bartholomew's Day, less disgraceful certainly because fewer victims were sacrificed and because the atrocities were not committed under the sanction of the government, which on the contrary used its endeavors to punish the crime. It was committed by the mob of Paris, an unbridled power which rivaled and even controlled the legislature. The atrocities of the 3rd of September were the result of fanaticism rather than of absolute brutality. The authors of the massacres put to death one of their own party for having committed theft during the executions. This dreadful event, continued the emperor, rose out of the force of circumstances in the spirit of the moment. No political change ever takes place unattended by popular fury. The peoples are never exposed to danger without committing disorders and sacrificing victims. The Prussians entered the French territory, and the people, before they advanced to meet them, resolved to take revenge on their adherents in Paris. Probably this circumstance was not without its influence on the safety of France. Who can doubt that if, during recent events, the friends of the invaders had been the victim of similar horrors, France would have fallen under the yoke of foreigners? But this could not have happened, for we had become legitimate. The duration of authority, our victories, our treaties, the reestablishment of our old manners had rendered our government regular. We could not plunge into the same horrors as had been committed by the mob. For my part, I neither could nor would become a king of the Jacquerie. No social revolution ever takes place unaccompanied by violence. Every revolution of this kind is at first merely a revolt. Time and success alone can exalt and legitimize it, but still it can never be brought about unattended by outrage. And people enjoying authority and fortune are required to relinquish these advantages. They, of course, resist. Force is then resorted to. They are compelled to yield. In France, this point was gained by the lantern and public executions. The reign of terror commenced on the 4th of August with the abolition of titles of nobility, tithes, and feudal rights, the wrecks of which were scattered among the multitude who then, for the first time, understood and really felt interested in the revolution. Before this period, there was so much of dependence and religious spirit among the people that many doubted whether the harvest could be gathered in without the king and the tithes. A revolution, concluded the emperor, is one of the greatest evils by which mankind can be visited. It is a scourge of the generation by whom it is brought about, and all the advantages it procures cannot make amends for the misery with which it embitters the lives of those who participate in it. It enriches the poor, who still remains unsatisfied, and it impoverishes the rich, who cannot forget the downfall. It subverts everything, and at its commencement brings misery to all and happiness to none. Beyond a doubt, true social happiness consists in the harmony and the peaceful possession of the relative enjoyments of each class of people in regular and tranquil times. Every individual has his share of felicity. The cobbler in his stall is as content as the king on his throne. The soldier is not less happy than the general. The best founded revolutions at the outset bring universal destruction in their train. The advantages they may produce are reserved for a future age. Ours seem to have been an irresistible fatality. It was a moral eruption which could no more be prevented than a physical eruption. When the chemical combinations necessary to produce the latter are complete, it bursts forth. In France, the moral combinations which produce a revolution had arrived at maturity, and the explosion accordingly took place. We asked the emperor whether he thought it would have been possible to suppress the revolution in its birth, and he replied that, if not impossible, the attempt would at least have been difficult. Perhaps, said he, the storm might have been laid or averted by some great Machiavellian act, by striking with one hand the great ringleaders and with the other making concessions to the nation, granting freely the reformation required by the age, part of which had already been mentioned in the famous royal sitting. And yet, after all, he observed, this would only have been to guide and direct the revolution. He thought that some other plan of the same kind might perhaps have succeeded on the 10th of August if the king had remained triumphant. These two periods, he said, were the only ones which afforded any chance, however desperate. For at the affair of Versailles, the people had not entirely shaken off their allegiance. And on the 10th of August, they were already beginning to be tired of disorder. But the individuals who were chiefly interested in quelling the revolutionary spirit were not adequate to encounter the difficulties of the moment. The emperor then took a rapid glance at the series of errors committed during this period. The line of conduct then pursued said he was truly pitiable. Louis XVI should have had a prime minister and Mr. Necker in the finance department. Prime ministers seem to have been invented for the last reigns of the French monarchy, and yet the prevailing false notion and vanity of the time caused them to be dispensed with. A great deal was said respecting the equivocal conduct of several great personages during this critical period, and the emperor said, we condemn Louis XVI, but independently of his weakness, he was placed in peculiar circumstances. He was the first monarch on whom the experiment of modern principles was tried. His education, his innate opinions led him to believe that all that he defended either openly or secretly belonged to him of right. There might be a sort of honesty even in his want of faith, if I may be permitted to say so. At a subsequent period, the same conduct would have been inexcusable and even reprehensible. Add to all this that Louis XVI had everyone against him, and one may form an idea of the innumerable difficulties which fate had accumulated on that unhappy prince, the misfortunes of the Stuarts, which have excited such deep interest, were not more severe. The 4th, the emperor sent for me after he had finished his breakfast. He was stretched on a sofa with several books scattered about him. He wore his nightcap and he looked pale. Las causas, said he, I am unwell. I have been looking over a great many books, but I can find nothing to interest me. I feel wearied. He fixed his eye on me. That eye, naturally so animated, was now dim, and its expression told me more than his tongue had uttered. Sit down, said he, pointing to a chair that was beside him, loaded with books, and let us converse a little. He spoke of the island of Elba, of the life he had led there, of some visits which he had received. He then put some questions to me concerning Paris and the French court during the corresponding period, the conversation having led to the mention of the king's bodyguard. Someone present remarked, as a curious circumstance, that there was a deserter from the guard in Napoleon's suite at St. Helena. How? Explain yourself, said the emperor. Sire, continued the individual who had just spoken, at the time of the Restoration, one of the captains of the guard, for whom I entertained great friendship, and who, in spite of the difference of our opinions, had always evinced a high regard for me, proposed to enter my son in his company, assuring me that he would treat him as though he were his own. I replied that he was too young, and that the appointment might retard the progress of his education. But my friend silenced all the objections. I, however, requested some time to consider of the matter, and on my mentioning it to some persons of my acquaintance, they were astonished that I should have declined so good an offer, and assured me that in a short time my son might attain great advancement without any interruption of his education. I then waited on the captain of the guard and acknowledged that I had not shown myself sufficiently grateful for his offer, and he replied that he was fully aware I had not understood the extent of the advantage he proposed to me. However, by one circumstance or another, your majesty returned before my son had the honor of being presented to his colonel, and I took him from his lyceum on our departure for St. Helena. He is clearly and truly a deserter." The emperor laughed heartily and said, "This is another effect of revolutions. What new interests, connections, and opinions they create. It is fortunate when they do not disunite families and set the best friends at variance with each other." He then began to question me concerning my family and concluded by saying, "I saw in Alphonse de Beauchamp's work your name mentioned among the individuals who on the 30th of March endeavored to excite demonstrations in favor of the royal family in the Place Louis XV. I know it was not you. I think you once explained the matter to me, but I have forgotten the particulars." "Sire," said I, "it was a cousin of mine of the same name. The circumstance vexed me a good deal at the time. I inserted contradictions in the journals, and it was rather droll that my cousin, on his part, addressed letters to the public prince, desiring that he might be particularly specified as the individual alluded to. I believe that the general way in which the name was introduced in Alphonse de Beauchamp's work was kindly meant on the part of the author, who wished by this means to afford me an opportunity of ingratiating myself in favor of the ruling party. If I had a mind to do so, I must do my cousin the justice to say that when I obtained an appointment about your majesty's person, I several times offered to solicit for him a post in your household or elsewhere, but as he constantly declined, I wish he may now enjoy the reward of his fidelity." The emperor again repeated that all private interests were subverted by revolutions, "and it is these private wounds," said he, "which occasions the general ferment and renders the shocks so acute and violent." The weather was so bad throughout the whole of the day that it was impossible to go out. The emperor dismissed me and sent for General Gourgaud, to whom he dictated in his library from 2 to 6 o'clock almost the whole of Moreau's campaign during the consulate. After dinner he read to us Madame de Maintenon's celebrated sumptuary letter to her brother, in which she fixes her household expenditure at 6 francs a year. The emperor had several volumes of the Grand Homme brought to him, and after perusing some articles, he amused himself by looking at the outline portraits that are at the end of each volume. The 5th. Today, in the course of my morning conversation with the emperor, I happened to mention some acts of oppression and injustice which excited dissatisfaction in the public mind and rendered him unpopular, because they were executed in his name, but were by many supposed to emanate from him. "But how," said he, "was there no one among the multitude that surrounded me, none of my chamberlains, who had sufficient spirit and independence to complain and bring me these matters? I would have rendered justice wherever it had been withheld. Sire, if you would have ventured to call your attention to these things, did you really stand so much in awe of me? I suppose you dreaded my sharp rebuffs. But you ought to have known that I always lent a ready ear to everyone, and that I never refused to administer justice. You should have balanced the reward of the good action with the danger of the reprimand. After all, I confess that my reproofs were in most instances the result of calculation. They were frequently the only means I possessed of learning a man's temper, of discovering by stealth the different shades of his character. I had little time for inquiry, and a reprimand was one of my experiments. For example, I lately gave you a repulse, and this enabled me to discover that you were somewhat headstrong, extremely susceptible, sufficiently candid, but sullen, and I may say too sensitive. He added, pinching my ear, I was, continued he, obliged to surround myself, as it were, with a halo of fear. Otherwise, having risen as I did from amidst the multitude, many would have made free to eat out of my hand or to pat me on the shoulder. We are naturally inclined to familiarity. The weather continued very bad, and the emperor spent the chief part of the day in writing, as he did yesterday. The governor has renewed his cavilling on the subject of our supplies, descending into petty details about a few bottles of wine or a few pounds of meat. Instead of 8,000 pounds, the sum fixed by government, he now applied for an allowance of 12,000, which he himself declared to be indispensable. But he insisted on having the surplus delivered into his own hands, or subjecting us to great retrenchments. He bargained for our existence. When this was mentioned to the emperor, he replied that the government might do as he pleased, but he desired at all events that he might not be troubled about the business. In the evening, the conversation again turned on Madame de Maintenon, and the emperor made many remarks on her letters, her character, her influence, and the affairs of her time. He asked for the historical dictionary to read the articles on the Noailles family, and he retired to rest at 11 o'clock.